I'll never forget the summer of 2021. It was supposed to be just another routine week of house sitting, something I'd done countless times before. But that week, something happened that I still struggle to explain. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just my imagination. This story is hard for me to tell, but I feel like if I don't share it, I'll never stop thinking about it. It was mid-July, and I had agreed to house sit for a family friend, Mrs. Klein, while she took a vacation out of state. Her house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where nothing ever really happens. It was a big, old Victorian-style home, and she'd lived there alone since her husband passed away years ago. She had no kids and no pets, just a lot of space and a lot of memories in that place. The first couple of days were pretty uneventful. I spent most of my time watching TV, raiding her kitchen, and scrolling through my phone. But on the third night, things started to feel off. I was lying in bed, about to fall asleep, when I heard what I thought was a soft creaking noise coming from downstairs. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old houses make noises, right? But as I lay there, trying to convince myself it was nothing, the sound came again. This time it was clearer, like footsteps. I sat up in bed, listening intently, my heart beginning to race. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they seemed to be moving through the house, getting closer. I told myself it was probably just the house settling, or maybe even a neighbor outside, but the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from inside. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The pale beam cut through the darkness of the room as I slipped out of bed and crept toward the door. I could hear the footsteps more clearly now, like someone was walking down the hallway. The house was silent except for that sound, and I felt a chill run down my spine. When I finally opened the bedroom door, the hallway was empty, but I could still hear the faint creak of footsteps now coming from downstairs. I called out, "Hello!" But there was no answer. Just more footsteps, this time heading toward the back of the house. I didn't know what else to do, so I decided to go downstairs and check. Maybe someone had broken in, though I hadn't heard any windows smash or doors open. As I made my way down the staircase, the creaking stopped. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The living room was empty. The kitchen, too. I checked every window and door, and everything was locked up tight. No sign of forced entry. No sign of anyone at all. But that's when I noticed something strange. The back door, which Mrs. Klein had told me to always keep locked, had the deadbolt turned halfway, like someone had tried to unlock it, but didn't finish the job. I stood there, staring at the door, my hand hovering over the lock. Had I forgotten to lock it earlier? Or had someone tried to get in? I decided to double-check the house just to be sure. Room by room, I searched every corner, under beds, behind curtains. But there was no one. By the time I finished, I felt like I was going crazy. The footsteps, the half-locked door, it didn't make any sense. Finally, exhausted and more than a little spooked, I went back to bed, leaving the hallway light on, just in case. The next morning, everything felt normal again, and I tried to laugh off what had happened the night before. Maybe I just imagined it, or maybe the house really was settling. I went about my day, trying to shake the lingering unease, but as the sun set that evening, I started to dread the coming night. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. This time, they were louder, like whoever, or whatever, was walking had no intention of being quiet. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were moving down the hallway, directly toward the bedroom. I grabbed my phone and flicked on the flashlight again, but the light felt useless in the suffocating darkness. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, terrified of what might happen next. Suddenly, the door handle turned ever so slowly. I could hear the metal mechanism shifting, the soft click as the door began to creak open. But the door didn't swing all the way open. It stopped, just ajar, like someone was standing there, watching me through the crack. I froze. Every fiber of my being was telling me to run, to get out of that house, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. I stared at the door, waiting for something to happen. But after what felt like an eternity, nothing did. The door stayed open, but no one came in. Eventually, I mustered the courage to get out of bed and approach the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. I yanked the door open, expecting to come face to face with whoever or whatever was there, but the hallway was empty. I was alone, That was it for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff, threw it in my bag, and got out of that house as fast as I could. I called Mrs. Klein the next morning and made up some excuse about a family emergency, but I never told her what really happened. I couldn't. To this day, I don't know what was in that house. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Or maybe there was something else, something I can't explain. But I do know this. Whatever was walking through that house wasn't me, and it wasn't Mrs. Klein. I haven't house sat for anyone since. I still get chills every time I think about this. What happened to me isn't something you easily forget. It was the fall of 2019, and I had just moved into a new apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place in a decent part of town, but it was mine. I had a new job, a new start. Everything was going well until I met him. It was a Friday night, and I was coming back from work, exhausted after a long week. The weather was getting colder, and the streets were unusually quiet as I made my way up the steps to my apartment building. As I reached for my keys, I noticed someone standing at the end of the hallway, near the stairwell. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and a hat, with his head slightly bowed. He didn't look like anyone I'd seen in the building before, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, but before closing it, I glanced back down the hallway. The man was still standing there, motionless, as if he were waiting for something. A weird feeling crept over me, but I shook it off. It was a big building. Maybe he was just a new tenant. Over the next few days, I started seeing the man more frequently. Sometimes he'd be in the lobby, other times near the elevator. He always stood in the same way, still, quiet, and with his head slightly bowed like he was trying to go unnoticed. What made it even stranger was that no one else seemed to acknowledge him. People would walk by, talking on their phones or carrying groceries, and not a single person would glance his way. It was like he didn't exist. One night, after coming home late, I saw him again. This time, he was standing at the far end of the hallway on my floor, near my door. I froze for a moment, my stomach tightening. He wasn't moving, just staring at the floor with that same strange posture. I don't know why, but something about him filled me with dread. I quickly unlocked my door and hurried inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, my heart racing. What was his deal? Was he following me? Was it all just a coincidence? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the growing fear that something wasn't right about this man. A few nights later, I came home late again. This time, the building was eerily silent. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw him once more, standing directly in front of my door. He wasn't facing me. He was just staring at my door, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. My skin crawled and my heart pounded in my chest. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. He didn't move. "Can I help you with something?" Nothing. He didn't even turn to acknowledge me. That's when I realized I'd had enough. I wasn't about to let this guy scare me in my own home. I marched down the hallway toward him, determined to confront him. But as I got closer, something happened that I can't explain. He vanished. I don't mean he turned and walked away. I mean, one second he was there and the next, he was gone, like he had melted into thin air. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the empty space where he had just been standing. My heart was racing, my breath caught in my throat. I backed away slowly, still trying to comprehend what I had just seen, and rushed into my apartment, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump, and I kept expecting to see him standing outside my window or hear him knocking on my door. But nothing happened. The next morning, I went to the building's management office to ask about the man. I described him, tall, wearing a dark coat and a hat, always standing in the hallway, but the manager just gave me a puzzled look. "There's no one like that living here," she said. "Are you sure you didn't see someone visiting?" I insisted that I had seen him multiple times, but she checked her records and confirmed that no one matching his description was listed as a tenant. She even reviewed the security footage from the hallways, and there was nothing. No tall man, no dark coat, nothing. It was like he had never been there. I left the office feeling more confused and unsettled than ever. Who was this guy, and how was it possible that no one else had seen him? Over the next few weeks, I started avoiding coming home late. I'd linger at work or hang out with friends, trying to distract myself from the creeping fear that I was being watched. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling that he was still there, somewhere in the building, lurking just out of sight. One night, after I'd finally started to relax a little, I was sitting on my couch watching TV when I heard a knock at the door. My blood ran cold. It was late and I wasn't expecting anyone. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing just out of view, waiting for me to open the door. Slowly, I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but when I looked through the peephole again, the hallway was still empty. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I never saw the man again after that night. I don't know if he finally gave up, or if he's still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. All I know is that I moved out of that apartment as soon as my lease was up, and I've never looked back. But every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of a tall figure in a crowd, or hear footsteps echoing in an empty hallway, and I'll remember him, the vanishing man, and I'll wonder if I'll ever really be free of him. This story is one I've only ever told a few people, and even now, I'm not sure I should be sharing it. But after all this time, it still weighs on me. Maybe putting it out there will finally help me make sense of it, though I doubt I ever will. It happened in the summer of 2023. My girlfriend Sarah and I had just moved into a new apartment. It was an old brick building downtown, full of character. High ceilings, hardwood floors, and that slightly creaky lived-in feel you expect from a place with history. We both loved it immediately, and the price was too good to pass up. The building had been around for over a century, originally used as a warehouse before being converted into apartments in the early 90s. It wasn't the nicest place in the world, but it had charm. The first couple of months there were uneventful. Life went on as usual. That was until we found the door. It started when we noticed a strange draft in the hallway near our bedroom. No matter how tightly we closed the windows, there was always a faint breeze coming from somewhere. It wasn't cold, but it had that unsettling quality, like air was coming from a space that shouldn't exist. At first, we didn't think much of it, assuming it was just one of those quirks that come with living in an old building. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, Sarah stopped in the hallway, staring at the wall across from the bedroom door. She had this puzzled look on her face, and I asked her what was wrong. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I listened for a moment, but all I could hear was the hum of the city outside. Hear what? "There's something behind the wall, like a faint knocking." I stepped closer, pressing my ear to the wall. At first, there was nothing, just the muffled noise of life outside. But then I heard it. Soft, irregular tapping, like someone knocking from the other side of the wall. I pulled back, my heart skipping a beat. "That's weird. Maybe it's a neighbor." Sarah shook her head. "There's no apartment on the other side. It's the building's outer wall." I hadn't realized it before, but she was right. The layout of the apartment didn't make sense for there to be a neighboring unit on that side. It was supposed to be a dead end, a solid wall. For the next few days, the knocking continued, always faint, always coming from the same spot. The draft, too, seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't until the following weekend, when we decided to investigate more closely, that we discovered the door. We had been running our hands along the wall, trying to figure out where the draft was coming from, when my fingers brushed over something that didn't feel right. The wall wasn't completely smooth. There was a slight indentation, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and shone it on the wall, and that's when we saw it, a faint outline of a door frame, hidden beneath layers of paint and plaster. At first, we didn't know what to do. Why would there be a sealed-off door in our apartment? We stood there staring at it, the knocking still faintly tapping from the other side. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to pry away at the plaster. It wasn't easy, but after a few hours of chipping away, the door became clear. It was an old wooden door, the kind you'd see in an industrial building. The handle was missing, and the wood was warped and rotting, as if it had been sealed for decades. There were no hinges on our side, no keyhole. Nothing that suggested it had ever been used to come and go. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah muttered, running her fingers over the surface. "Why would they seal off a room?" "Maybe it's just an old storage space or something," I offered, though I wasn't sure I believed that myself. Against my better judgment, I decided to open it. I grabbed a crowbar and wedged it into the seam, forcing the door to give way. It groaned as the wood splintered, and after a few minutes of prying, it finally creaked open. What lay beyond the door was a small, pitch-black room. It was completely windowless, and the air inside was thick with dust, stale and cold. The space couldn't have been more than 10 by 10 feet, with bare walls and a low ceiling. But the strangest thing was that the room was completely empty, except for a single chair, sitting right in the center. A sense of dread settled over me as I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the cobby darkness. The room felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be found. I moved toward the chair, my footsteps echoing eerily in the confined space. The chair itself was old, wooden, and covered in dust, but otherwise unremarkable. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Sarah stayed at the doorway, reluctant to enter. "We should leave this alone," she said, her voice tense. "This is not right." I agreed, but my curiosity was getting the better of me. There was no sign of why this room had been sealed off, no indication of what it had been used for. But as I stood there staring at that chair, I felt an overwhelming sense that we weren't supposed to be there. That's when the knocking started again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from inside the room. Sarah gasped, stepping back from the doorway. I turned, my heart racing, but the room was empty. No one else was there, and yet the knocking persisted, louder now, echoing through the small space. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, and without another thought, I grabbed Sarah's hand and we bolted out of the room. We slammed the door shut, sealing it off again, and called the landlord the next day to report what we'd found. He came by with a maintenance crew, but when they pried open the door again, the room was gone. I'm not talking about the chair or the walls. It was literally gone. There was no door, no hidden space behind the wall, just solid brick. The landlord looked at us like we were crazy. We moved out 2 weeks later. But I still think about that room, the knocking, the chair, the way it seemed to vanish overnight. Sarah and I don't talk about it anymore. But sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I swear I can still hear the faint sound of knocking, as if it's following me, waiting for me to find it again.